All right, so now third part of this, we'll actually get into how to connect all of this together, the interface with the code to build useful programs, or at least at first just programs that are running, and hopefully then we get useful after that. So a good place to start when you're learning how to code here is the models library. NetLogo just comes with a bunch of models pre-built with it. So does Arena, actually. A lot of people don't realize that, is that that Arena that we'll use in most of the rest of the class, there's actually a bunch of pre-built models embedded within it that you can use to sort of learn advanced things that aren't maybe as easy to cover in class. And a lot of these big simulation programs do that because they know everybody needs a place to start. So where to start in NetLogo, you go to the File, the Models library. If I jump over to my NetLogo that I have running here, I can do File, Models library, discard my current changes because this will open up um, over top of whatever I have running. You can only have one thing open at a time inside a single NetLogo instance. And if I were to actually go with this old version of NetLogo that I kind of took snapshots of in this lecture and compare the models available for it to the models available for now, I'd find that there's a lot more models that are available now. So people, they are growing the sample models as well, which is kind of interesting, so kind of fun. Okay, so as an example, I could have gone into here and I could have opened this autumn model, which is kind of an interesting one. In this autumn model, once it loads here, and then I'll see that what they're actually simulating in an agent-based model is, strangely enough, a tree. A tree where the leaves are agents. And so if you were to think about, if I were to hit go here, and so you can see that there's rain and the leaves are changing colors. The leaves will eventually fall off the tree. And so I can actually maybe I can increase the tick speed here, make the sim run a little faster. And so there I kind of accelerated time so that now that I went to the end of the sim where all the leaves now are on the ground. So strangely enough, they actually were able to sort of model all of the cool sort of plant physiological properties of leaves, the things that represent, like why does a leaf change its color and all of those sorts of things. Things that we might be able to understand in a laboratory about an individual leaf. And they could put all of those leaves together on a tree, and then that system of leaves together ends up being something that would be very difficult to understand, maybe directly in the lab. But to really test our understanding of whether we understand what's going on with the individual leaves, we can see, does the simulated tree operating on the rules that we think operate at the level of leaves do what is sort of expected. And we get certain patterns here of green leaves and brown leaves for constant weather conditions, but I could have gone through and actually changed the weather conditions. I could have made it hotter, I could have made it colder, and then I could see how that changes the progression of these leaves over time. So that's kind of the power of this tool here, is that using an agent-based model, which I wouldn't normally think of for simulating a tree, I can actually test my insights into sort of plant physiology. So you can see under leaf averages, chlorophyll, water, sugar, carotene, anthocyanin, attachedness, so whether it's attached or not. So these are like important pigments, chlorophyll and anthocyanin and carotene, so that give the leaves a different color. So the kind of dark reds are anthocyanins, and carotenes are sort of more orangey or maybe yellowy. They're depicting at least as yellow in the graph. And the chlorophyll, of course, the green, and is different. If you view these as attributes of each individual leaf, as the different relative amount of these attributes, as the chlorophyll decreases, and then it might then die off, and all you have left is the anthocyanin. So that's what causes the leaves to look kind of red. So that's that you can view the amount of these compounds inside a leaf as attributes of an agent that can be modified during the run of the sim. So I think that's kind of fun. Anyways, so I can open up this, the fully formed model, and I can go into the code, and then I can sweep through the code and then see how it's working and maybe make edits to it. if I have something that I want to work in a sort of similar way. Um, so this is a relatively involved simulation, so the code is a bit long. And I can go into the info tab, which has been nicely populated, as you should do for any good NetLogo model that you're exporting to the public. And it tells me all sorts of things that I can end up doing with this model. And notice there is an edit button there. If I click on this edit, then you can see that it kind of uses this kind of markdown sort of syntax in order to make this work here. So that's where you end up putting in your documentation, all inside this tool here. All right. So that's all I'm kind of saying on these slides here. You click on the info tab, you get that info. You click on the code, and then you end up seeing the code that is implemented for the particular model. So it is sort of the interaction between the code and the things on the interface that make the model go. So let's look back on the interface. So if I go back to the interface here, I might open up a simpler model. So I'll maybe open up ants again, because that's the one I have in the actual presentation here. And so it has these two buttons, set up and go. If I right click on this button, go to edit, I see that it references setup. So if I go into the code, I then look for, and there is a setup there. So whenever I click that setup button, it runs this procedure once. And this procedure, all the things it does, I won't go into great detail, but to make a long story short, it clears the world. It gives all of the turtles a shape that looks kind of like an ant. So there's a list of shapes you can find. And then it creates a certain number of turtles. And that's where, again, if I go back to the interface, I see I have a population slider. So that population slider acts like a global variable, which then shows up right here. So I can create that many, however I set there. And whenever one is created, then each one that gets created, it's its size set to 2 and its color set to red. And then I've got another procedure down here, set up patches, which sets up the color and attributes of each patch. And I reset the clock to 0, and then setup is done. So every time you click setup, it'll do that. So if I click setup over and over again, what I'm actually doing is I'm killing all of the agents that I previously created and recreating them. So if I were to hit go and undo the go and hit setup, you see they disappear because they all got killed when that clear all hit, and then they got recreated back at the center. So then that go button, if I were to look behind it, edit, I see it's running go, but it has this forever button that is selected, which means that there is a routine called go in the code, and this go button is going to run that routine once and then keep running it until I unselect the go button, or until the code indicates that it is finished. So if you have no more agents left over, you can issue a command to stop the simulation that'll naturally pop that go button back up. So if I look in the code, I can see, well, what's going on with go. So if I scroll down, there should eventually be a to go, and there it is. So every time that go button is clicked, it is going to run this over and over and over again. So there's no loop inside the go button. The go button is only one instance of the sim, but then the go button itself runs the instances over and over and over again. And so that's what we're kind of going on there. So that's in the main code. That's what I'm highlighting now, this to go, the main presentation here. So I'll go back to that in NetLogo. Here it is in NetLogo. It may have been reformatted slightly over time. It looks like it's pretty much the same. And there's sort of a different way to think of how you do the code in here. Remember, the setup button created 170 turtles, which are the ants. We just can call them turtles unless we've given them a particular breed name. And we can ask each turtle to do something. And so what's hidden behind this ask is basically a big like for loop. It's basically saying, go through every single turtle and ask them all to do this before we can move on to the next portion of the code. Now the interesting thing is the ask doesn't move through the turtles in any reliable order. So it's as if they're being asked instantaneously to do something. So at least that's the way you're kind of supposed to think about it. If you need them to go through in a particular order, always ask the turtle with a who identifier of 1 or the turtle with a who identifier of 2 and so on and so forth. You can write like a for loop to do that, but in almost every case you just ask all of them to do it at once, or you can put these things after the ask that say like ask turtles with, and then in the with you can put an attribute state. So ask turtles with hunger greater than 5, and that would end up asking everyone who's very hungry to do something, whereas everyone who's not very hungry, you're not asking them to do anything. But this is just asking all of them, and then this code in here, basically there's nuancing details here, but this code, like this line here, is only runs up to early points in the simulation. This is kind of an old NetLogo trick to create agents not all at once. And so effectively this is saying that if your identifier is greater than the current number of ticks, like whatever the clock is, then we don't care about you right now. You can just stop and stay right there. And so as the clock increases, that's as the tick increases, then this is going to be true for fewer and fewer agents. And so eventually all the agents are going to keep running, but initially only a few agents are going to make it through here because they're the ones that have the who that's low enough to make this happen. All right, so if we look down at what goes on in here, we basically ask an agent, are you red? And so color is used here as sort of a behavioral parameter. So if you're red, then you are in a behavioral state where you look for food, and otherwise if you're not red, then you're in a behavioral state where you probably just found food and you should be carrying it back home. Regardless of which behavioral state, once you figure out what general program you're running in, this wiggle, if you were to scroll down and look at it, is going to basically make the ants not move in a straight line, but to kind of wiggle just a little bit. So it's going to turn them just a slight bit off of their current orientation by a random amount. And then this FD is short for forward, so that's going to move them forward 1. So basically this thing will run, every time go is run, this gets run once, which causes this code to run on all of the ants or turtles just one time. And during that one time, they decide whether they're looking for food, and they do things specific to looking for food or returning to nest, or they do things specific to returning to nest. They wiggle a little bit so they look more ant-like, and then they move forward. And then you could move on down through this, and so this command has to do with spreading out those pheromones that have been laid down, and then this has to do with causing those pheromones to decay as they evaporate over time. This moves the clock forward, and then that ends go. All right, so what I'm trying to get at is that in the NetLogo agent-based programming paradigm, it's very different than the paradigms you're probably familiar with if you think about Java or other sort of more procedural languages where you're going to sort of manually have to schedule what everybody does. Instead, NetLogo handles the scheduling, and you issue these ask commands. And so agents have to be asked to do things. So you are an agent, actually. You're what the agent of that's called the observer. So you're always there. You're kind of this godlike observer that can look over them, and you as the observer in your context can ask sets of other types of agents. Those could be turtle sets or patch sets or link sets to do things. So, and then you also can get values from them. So you can ask turtles what their current attributes are set to. So, but you're always going to ask sets of agents. Now those sets might only have one turtle in them, but generally we're asking these sets. Now turtles can talk to each other, turtles can talk to patches, and turtles can talk to links. And also patches can talk to turtles, and links can talk to patches, and all of those combinations. So just like you, when you're in the observer context, you're writing the code, and unless you have switched context inside the code, you are always going to be in a context where you are outside of the turtle and you have to ask turtles to do things. But if you're writing the code for a turtle, those turtles can immediately have access to their own attributes without asking anyone anything. and they can then ask other turtles to modify their attributes. So me as an observer, if I'm writing that Go code, if I were to say set color red, NetLogo would say, I don't know what you mean because I don't know whose color you're talking about. So I'd have to say, okay, I'm sorry, I meant ask turtle 0 set color red. And that would say on a specific turtle, set the color equal to red. Now, if I were to write a routine that I knew that a turtle was always going to run, then in that routine, I could just put set color red because I know that that routine is only called in a turtle context. So let's say if I called my routine, turtle routine, if I were to say ask turtle 0 turtle routine, then that turtle routine is automatically run in the context of the turtle. So it has access to that turtle's attributes immediately without issuing another ask. So, and then I mentioned there's a special case where a turtle can actually access the attributes of the patch it's sitting on without asking anyone. It just immediately inherits those attributes. So getting used to this perspective of context, that you're naturally in an observer context, but then you can write routines that are run in a turtle context or in a patch context or in a breed context, then is the hardest thing to get used to when you're dealing with NetLogo. But in the end, once you get used to it, you find it's very liberating because there's a lot of details that you'd have to worry about if you were to write all of this stuff manually in C or Java or MATLAB or whatever that just automatically are handled from behind you or behind the scenes by NetLogo. And the ask paradigm is just kind of a way in which you tell NetLogo what you want without dealing with the implementation details of how it's actually going to happen, kind of like a spreadsheet. In a spreadsheet, you tell it what you want, and you don't worry about how the spreadsheet's actually going to calculate those cells. All right, so how do you figure out how to get your mind around all of this? Well, as I mentioned in the lab lectures as well, if you go to the help in NetLogo, so under the help here, there's a bunch of really nice resources, and over time, these resources have been added. So in this old version of NetLogo that's in the presentation, all we have is the user manual, the dictionary, and the users group. In the new version of NetLogo, it actually has a link to that text, to a new textbook that the authors of NetLogo have recently brought out. And so there's a textbook resource as well as the users group where you can ask questions. There's the dictionary, which tells you, which looks a little like what's here on the presentation here, which for every single command in NetLogo, it tells you roughly what it does. It gives you an example of it, tells you the syntax, and it gives you C alsos for you to read more. And so that ends up being very useful. And then there's this user manual that's sort of a more, it's a higher level view. And then if you go to the dictionary, on the left-hand side of the dictionary, you find links to all sorts of other resources, tutorials, and all sorts of other things like that. Now, if you right-click on something, like in the code, like p-color, like, I don't really know what p-color is, so I'm going to right-click on it. Then there is a show usage which shows up, and that's not actually what I meant to. Actually, I'm sorry, I meant to click on the quick help, which shows up, which brings you to just the section in the dictionary for that one thing that you're looking up. So, oh, I found out p-color is a built-in patch variable. It has the color of the patch. Got it. If I need to say, well, I need to know a little bit more, I can click on the dictionary, and then maybe I want to know other things about patches. Well, there's all sorts of things that are tied to patches, and I just clicked on in the table of contents here the patch category. And when I do that, it brings me to patch related, and this tells me all sorts of things, including p-color, that are associated with patches. So that's how we can use quick access to the dictionary. And then recently they've added things like the show usage, jump to declaration. These are ways in which to try to make it simpler to move around the editing stuff. That's kind of outside the scope of this lecture. But if you get used to using those, then it can make editing your code much more efficient. All right. So All right, so breeds. So this is nice that if you look in the NetLogo dictionary, if I were to sort of go to, let's find breeds in the NetLogo dictionary here. So try to search for breed. Okay, so there's a bunch of breed stuff. Well, I'm just going to try breeds here, and um, and so this I find out that breeds here is related to turtles here, and NetLogo provides a lot of nice examples here as well. So occasionally, what you'll find in the dictionary is these, not along with the examples, they'll actually have a nice code example that is baked right in here. And if I were to click on that, it'll bring me to a more elaborate code example and some information about it. So they've prepared a bunch of useful code examples that are linked from around the dictionary. So the dictionary's got all sorts of interesting and useful cross-references that we can find. Now, how do you, if let's say you wanted to jump into those code examples without using the dictionary? Well, it turns out the models library has a short circuit to some of those things. And so if I were to go into NetLogo and I were to go into models library, so sample models is really nice because we've got all these these working models, but occasionally I just want to know something a little simpler, so I can go into these code examples, and then under those code examples, that's where I can find like that breeds example. So back in the previous one, it said breeds and shapes example. So for this particular dictionary entry, which I thought was going to be under breeds but wasn't, it has a quick link to this code example, breeds and shapes. But I also can find that directly by looking in the code examples page, breeds and shapes here. And so the difference between these and the others is if I were to open up this code, which we just did here, I hit setup and I can say move monsters, move fish. I can see I've got monsters and fish, these two breeds. But this sim doesn't really do a whole lot, and not surprisingly, if I go into code, the code is super simple. So it's not even a page of code. But that's the whole point, is it's trying to demonstrate breeds. And so it's trying to demonstrate here that we can create a breed called monster, which I can refer to in plural as monsters, or a breed called fish, which I can refer to singularly as a fish and in plural as fish. So I've got these two breeds, and in my setup routine, I can set up by sprouting monsters and sprouting fish separately. So in the previous ants example, I just had turtles, but now I have both monsters and fish. And so this code example shows me how I set up these two different types of entities and how I build them, and then how I end up moving them. So every time I click the Move Monsters button, it runs the Move Monsters code, and that asks all the monsters. So instead of saying ask turtles, I say ask monsters to move forward. Just like the move fish asks all the fish to move forward. So that's a nice simple code example that demonstrates these things without having to get a very, very complicated piece of code. And there's a bunch of those. So if you're not quite sure what to deal with diffusion around edges, if you want to know about how to draw a box very quickly inside NetLogo, if you want to learn how to make balls bounce around an area, so I can go into this one and hit setup and go, and I see that, okay, now I've got, this is a nice simple example of where balls are bouncing off the edge of these. I can turn on traces, and if I look into the code, it shows me how I make bouncing work. And so I could just copy that in to a particular piece of code I have if I want agents to be able to reflect off of boundaries. So really useful resource.